Today, I want to start an examination of what the Federal Reserve has been up to this year under the cover of this never-ending pandemic. I know it's been a long time since I made a video, and a lot has gone on, and I want to start getting into it because I found the coverage of what the Federal Reserve has been doing this year to be lacking. I found a lot of partial information, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of disinformation. But the sum total of it is that what the Fed has been behind, which is basically a ruinous political upheaval and a fundamental transformation of the economy, that has not been covered basically sufficiently to my way of thinking. And I want to change that. And I think the way to get into this is to go back to an older debate that started during quantitative easing on the heels of the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, when the Fed did start its QE program. And the debate and the issue back then was, and still is, it's unresolved, at least until now, the issue is, can the Federal Reserve, through its large-scale asset purchases, through quantitative easing, jack up the stock market, basically boost up the stock market? And that debate really started back in 2009. I'll cover that in a few minutes. But I think that is a good way to begin explaining how the Fed is meddling in the real economy and changing fundamentally the economy from one in which we have an organic system where winners and losers are sort of sorted out through free choice and in the marketplace, to an economy where the Federal Reserve is picking winners and losers. And the way the Federal Reserve is doing that is it is using its balance sheet to get money into the real economy. And I'm going to show you that in this episode. And as I say, the debate over QE, it was never really resolved. It's gone on. You know, does QE jack up the stock market? And the reason it was unresolved, and it hasn't been resolved to date, is that the evidence back then really wasn't clear-cut one way or the other. It really wasn't particularly compelling. That has changed this year, and I'm going to lay out very compelling evidence to show you that indeed the Fed is using its balance sheet to produce new money in the real economy and get real money in the real economy into the hands of the people it wants to get that money to. And that's the bottom line. And no one really is covering that. And I want to change that. I'm going to start with this episode. This may take a few episodes, but I'm going to begin that process today in this episode. To get into this, I want to go back to a clip that we've actually seen before. This is a clip from Bloomberg TV. This is January 29th of this year. That is Bill Dudley on the right. He is the former head of the New York Federal Reserve. And he's on Bloomberg to talk about what the Fed is up to. Let me take a step back. The Federal Reserve had been reducing its balance sheet throughout 2018 up until September of 2019. The market threw a bit of a hissy fit during that time. And the New York Fed then jumps into the repo market and expands the balance sheet by about $400 billion, if memory serves. And the market magically recovers and it actually achieves new highs. And that is when, in the end of January of this year, Bill Dudley then comes on Bloomberg to say, oh no, the Fed can't even possibly jack up the stock market. We can't do that at all. The people who think that we're doing that are just misinformed. And he lays out the explanation for why, in theory, the Fed can't jack up the stock market. So let's look at this clip a second time.
When people say we're flush with liquidity because the Fed is doing this and it's boosting risk assets, what do they mean by that and what are they getting wrong?
Well, they have this idea that when the Fed buys T-bills, they're adding reserves to the banking system, and somehow those reserves are leaking out and leading to greater demand for the stock market. But the reality is the reserves don't leak out of the banking system because if someone withdraws their money from a bank, they make a purchase, that money flows right back into the banking system. Banks can't affect how many reserves there are in the banking system. The Fed determines that. Those reserves are then not used for other stuff like buying bonds or buying equities. The reason why the stock market is going up is pretty simple. The economy is doing well, earnings are rising, and the Fed has basically said that they're on hold for quite a while. They want inflation to rise above 2% before they even begin to contemplate tightening monetary policy again. And that's a big change from where we were a year ago.
Okay, what you just saw is probably the biggest lie by omission that you'll ever see in your life. You've got to remember that Bill Dudley worked at Goldman Sachs for 24 years. Goldman Sachs is a criminal enterprise that runs on fraud, and Goldman's preferred method of perpetrating fraud is called the concealment of material information in legal terms and lay terms. It's lying by omission. So everything Bill Dudley just said to you is true. It's actually factually correct. It's why he has that shit-eating grin on his face, because he knows that he's left out the most important thing. So everything he's saying is true. He is saying that reserves, and I want you to think of reserves as white marbles, okay? And he's right. Reserves are created by the Federal Reserve. They don't leak out into the regular economy. You and I don't use reserves. We don't have accounts at the Fed, at least not yet. We use red marble money. Our money is created by commercial banks. And so Dudley is actually right. Our money and our electronic money, that's what I'm talking about. And the Fed's electronic money is reserves. And they're in different circuits. And I'm going to explain why we have a two-circuit monetary system in another video. For now, though, just think of our money in your bank account, my bank account. Our electronic money is red marbles. And the Fed's electronic money, which is used by commercial banks, it's created by the Fed, you can think of that as white marbles. And Dudley is absolutely correct that white marbles don't mix with and they don't interfere with red marbles. It just doesn't happen. But what he is leaving out is that when the Fed creates white marbles, when it creates reserves, it's not just creating them for no reason. Remember, we're talking about large-scale asset purchases. And so when the Fed creates reserves, it is doing that to purchase large-scale assets, like mortgage-backed securities, for example, or like the example he used, treasury bills, and it's using them to purchase those things on a very large basis. And so the thing he is leaving out is the structure of the transaction in which the Fed spends that reserve money. And he's not telling you that. And so the question really isn't, do reserves get into the regular economy? No, they don't. The real question is, does the Fed create reserves in a way, and does it structure the transaction with those reserves in such a way that new bank money, new red marbles are created in the real economy circuit? And that's what he's leaving out. And the answer to that question is most certainly yes, and we're going to get into that. One of the ways the Fed can choose to structure these transactions is such that when it creates $100 in reserve money, $100 in bank money is also created at the same time. It doesn't have to choose that structure, but it can. And I'm going to kind of model this right now with this Newton's cradle. And so here you have the Fed, and the way this would work is the Fed would structure the transaction, and it can choose the structure if it wants to. It can structure the transaction so that when the Fed puts $100 of reserve money into the transaction for the large-scale asset purchase, out comes $100 in bank money. Okay, let's slow things down so we can see exactly what the Fed is doing. It creates $100 in new reserves. That's the white marble on the left. It's going to put that money into a structured financial transaction, and bam, it buys their asset, and out comes $96 in new bank money. The Fed puts $100 of reserves in, bam, out comes $96 in new bank money, the red marble on the right. And the Fed can structure the transaction like this anytime it wants. And every time it does, $96 in new bank money comes out. That is what's been going on in 2020 throughout this whole year. The Fed can choose to use that structure if it wants. It doesn't have to, however. It's simply a choice the Fed can make. And that's one of the reasons back in 2008, the Fed didn't choose that structure all that often, as it turns out. And I'm going to show you that. And the evidence back then was unclear. But this year, what we're going to see is that $100 of reserve money created for these large-scale asset purchases results in the production of $96 of bank money in the real economy. And that is how the Fed is picking winners and losers. It's simply using its expanding balance sheet as a way to pick winners and losers and get money into the hands of its cronies and the people it wants to get money into the hands of. And it's just that simple, and no one is really covering this. Now I want you to notice something, that when the Fed creates that white marble reserve money, it creates $100 in new reserves, that reserve, that white marble, does not turn into the red marble. Instead, the white marble goes into, bam, and it pushes the red marble out. So every time the Fed is creating $100 in reserves this year, bam, out comes $96 in bank money. And that is how the Fed is controlling the real economy. It is using its balance sheet to control the production and to control the creation of new bank money. And it is doing that to the tune of 96 cents on the dollar this year. Now in this video, this is really the black box video. In the next video, I'm going to reverse engineer the transaction and show you. But for this video, what I'm going to show you is this. I'm simply showing you that $100 of reserve money going into the transaction results in $96 of bank money coming out of the transaction. $100 of reserve money in 2020, $96 of bank money comes out of the transaction. And that's what the Fed's doing this year. In the next video, I'm going to show you exactly how the Fed structures this transaction. If you want to know how it's doing it, you can just read Josh Marie's book, Debt by Design. And in particular, go to chapter 18. He has a wonderful discussion of exactly how the Fed uses its balance sheet, or how any central bank uses its balance sheet to jack up and jimmy up real money in the real economy, despite the fact that they're in two different circuits. I've provided links in the description below. Just click there if you want to read about it. Otherwise, just wait till my next video and I'll show you. But in this video, I'm simply going to show you what the Fed has been doing with its balance sheet this year. Okay, so when this liar here tells you that the reserve money doesn't leak out to the economy, yeah, that's true, but he's leaving out the fact that the Fed can choose to structure that transaction so that $100 in new reserve money, it forces the creation of $96 or $100 of new bank money in the real economy. And that's how the Fed is gaming up the stock market. And he's just not telling you that. He's telling you a partial truth. Anyway, how do we know all this? Well, there's two variables if you think about it. You have reserves on the one hand, reserve money on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have bank money. So those are the two variables. We also have two different time periods. We have QE1. I'm going to just broadly call it QE1 back in 2008 through 2015, 16, whatever it was. That's the slow motion QE. And then this year we have the real quick, the truculent addition of $3 trillion to the balance sheet. I'm going to generally refer to that as QE2, the really power QE. And what we can do, I'm going to do here, I'll walk us through it, is compare the Fed's addition of reserve money back in QE1 10 years ago, whatever it was, and I'm going to compare that to what's going on today. And by making that comparison, we can see that what the Fed is doing now is it's using the production of new reserve money to force the creation of new bank money. And that's what this liar here, Bill Dudley, has left out, that the Fed can choose to structure these transactions. And it didn't make that choice 10 years ago or whatever during QE1. And that's why the evidence really wasn't all that strong that QE was driving up the stock market. And we're about to see that. But it's really clear in QE2, it's really clear this year that the Fed is using new reserve money to drive the production of new bank money at the expense of Main Street. Who do you think this money is going to? But anyway, we'll get to all that. Let's just bring up, though, a graph of the Fed's balance sheet. And right now the graph is empty, but we're going to fill it in and sort of walk through the balance sheet. Okay, this graph is from January 2007 to January 2020, and it divides into three stages, but let's first zoom in so we can see what's going on a little better there. First, we have January of 2007 until the 2008 financial crisis, and you can see there the balance sheet never cracks $1 trillion, and it's pretty much back then all just currency in circulation, which is just cash. Then the financial crisis hits in September of 2008, and the balance sheet explodes way up over $1 trillion, and the Fed starts lending reserves against garbage collateral, and then it starts buying collateral, and it keeps buying these crap assets all the way until early 2015. And then from 2015, the balance sheet is flat. It dips a little bit as the Fed starts tapering there, and then it increases back up again as the Fed gets into the repo market, which we talked about. That starts happening in January of September of 2019. And the dip here starts in 2018 and ends in September of 2019, as I said. And that's when the Fed gets into the repo market here and starts increasing the balance sheet again. And that's pretty much it through January of this year. And that's when Bill Dudley shows up on Bloomberg with the balance sheet sitting at a little over $4 trillion. Okay, now the truth is, the reality is that when you look at this graph, this point right here, this is 2008, it took the Federal Reserve, it took it 95 years to get to that point. And even after 95 years, the balance sheet is sitting at below $1 trillion. And then what happens from here over basically the next 10 years is the balance sheet explodes from well below $1 trillion to up over $4 trillion. Now, this did not happen against the backdrop of nothing. The Fed just didn't do this just for the hell of it. There's a context to what's going on. So what I want to do here is let's reverse this tape and let's look at what's going on with the Fed and what it's doing with its balance sheet in the context and against the backdrop of the stock market. And I think that that will add a lot of color to what's going on with the Fed's balance sheet. That's a little more realistic view of what's going on. So let's just get into that. Now, until the crisis hits, the balance sheet looks pretty normal on the one hand, while the stock market, on the other hand, it's begun to trend down, but really nothing to write home about. And this is when all hell breaks loose for the next 6 months. And it's really hard at this point to separate cause and effect here. At the same time the market basically goes into free fall, the Fed blows up its balance sheet. And this is, you got to remember, this is all loans. This is the alphabet soup of Fed lending programs throughout the bailout period. This is TAF and TALF and the commercial paper funding facility and the money market mutual fund liquidity facility and all that. And because they're short-term loans, they're getting paid off at various rates. And the balance sheet is all over the place. At first it's going way up, and then it's going way down. And the stock market, on the other hand, and by very sharp contrast, is going in one direction, and that's down. And this is when, and this is March of 2009, two very curious things happen. One, President Obama comes out and says, you know, now's a great time to buy stocks because profits and earnings ratios are at historic lows. Now, obviously, somebody put him up to say that because, you know, profits are earnings, and he sounds like a total rube. But then this is exactly when, at the same time, and number two, the Fed starts making large-scale asset purchases, not just loans, purchases of assets, in particular mortgage-backed securities. And this is when the rumors about QE fueling the stock market really start flying. And it's easy to see why. I'm going to put a line here to mark the beginning of quantitative easing. And as you can see in this dividing line, you get a better idea of what's going on. And this is when the Fed started buying the assets really hard, mortgage-backed securities. And when that happens, the balance sheet rockets up to a new high, almost $2.4 trillion. And at the same time, the stock market rockets up itself by 50, maybe 75% there. And it's a huge rally on the back of the Fed's mortgage-backed security program. And what you're looking at here is the grist of the rumors about QE driving up the stock market. Okay, now you got to admit, at least superficially, that's a pretty decent case for quantitative easing jacking up the stock market. You have the blue line here. That's the Federal Reserve balance sheet measured in reserve money. It's going up. And in sympathy with that, you see the stock market going up right along with it. So, like I say, superficially, that looks like a decent case for quantitative easing jacking up the stock market. But guys like Dudley, the central bank apologists, the central planning apologists, they're ready for this. And they rightly point out that the balance sheet is measured in reserve money, and reserve money doesn't leak out into the bank money economy that's needed to drive up the stock market. But for that reason, though, that's not really the issue. The issue really isn't whether it leaks out. The issue is whether new reserve money can drive the creation of new bank money. And that's what's missing from this picture. And that's what's been missing from the picture the whole time and throughout this entire debate is what's going on with bank money. And now, to my way of thinking, the best measure of bank money is M2. I've talked about this in previous videos before. M2 is the Fed's broadest measure of bank money. And what we need to do is we need to look at bank money and see, the real question isn't whether reserves leak out into the economy. They don't. The real question is whether the massive creation of new reserves also drives the creation of new bank money. And that's what we need to look at. And so that's what we want to do is put bank money into this graph here and see what's going on with it while the Fed is driving up its balance sheet. So let's do that. So here is M2 from January 2007 up until the onset of quantitative easing, right at the financial crisis. And this here is M2 from the launch of quantitative easing until the Fed backs off its purchases of mortgage-backed securities, MBS. And that, to my way of thinking, is a very inconclusive outcome. Yeah, you can definitely see a bump in M2. Let me, especially with the help, if you put a little regression line in here, you can see that there's a bit of a bump in M2 there for sure. But on the other hand, though, if we isolate this down, you can see that if that bump in M2 is having any effect at all on the stock market, you got to concede that it's pushing the stock market in both directions. In other words, it's pushing the stock market really down for the first part of the bump, right, until the QE dividing line there, and then it's pushing the market up for the rest. And that's why I say the evidence really of QE driving up the stock market from 10 years ago, back when quantitative easing started, it wasn't all that good. It's inconclusive, to be quite frank. Okay, so you can see why the case for QE driving up the stock market is kind of muddled. Keep in mind that this is the most intense iteration of QE back in the day, back in QE1. It continues like that for years afterwards, but M2 just continues to muddle along. So if this is the best case you have for QE, and it is the most intense blast of the Fed's balance sheet for driving up the stock market, the case isn't all that clear because M2 just muddles along for years and years. So let's go ahead and take a look at that and just sort of see how things continue up until January of this year. This is what things look like for the remainder of the graph all the way through January of this year, which is just a couple months before the Fed uses the pandemic as a pretext for blowing out its balance sheet. Now, there are a couple things to note here. One, M2, like I said, just steadily increases. There's no bumps really into it to speak of. And then the other thing to look at is look at the crossover of the blue line and the orange line. And below that, you'll see that the market takes a little dip. And it takes a little dip when the Fed is tapering its balance sheet. You see the blue line going down. The market throws a little taper tantrum there, it was called. And then right after that, that is when the New York Fed enters the repo market and begins to drive the balance sheet back up. And the stock market responds quite nicely. It begins to go back up. And that is when Mr. New York Federal Reserve himself, Bill Dudley, comes on to tell us serfs, nothing to see here, nothing to look at all, go back to sleep in front of your television. Everything is fine. The Fed can't even possibly use its balance sheet to drive up the stock market.
When people say we're flush with liquidity because the Fed is doing this and it's boosting risk assets, what do they mean by that and what are they getting wrong?
Well, they have this idea that when the Fed buys T-bills, they're adding reserves to the banking system, and somehow those reserves are leaking out and leading to greater demand for the stock market. But the reality is the reserves don't leak out of the banking system because if someone withdraws their money from a bank, they make a purchase, that money flows right back into the banking system. Banks can't affect how many reserves there are in the banking system. The Fed determines that. Those reserves are not used for other stuff like buying bonds or buying equities. The reason why the stock market is going up is pretty simple. The economy is doing well, earnings are rising, and the Fed has basically said that they're on hold for quite a while.
Okay, so Dudley makes two major claims here. Let's zoom back out and let's get rid of that error. All right. The two big claims are that Dudley makes. One, the stock market's going up because the economy is doing so well. If Dudley wants to hitch his horse to that wagon, be my guest pal. We're going to see how that works out for you in a minute. The other big Dudley claim is that reserves aren't jacking up the stock market because reserves don't leak out into the economy. But as we pointed out, that's not really the issue, precisely because reserves don't leak out into the economy. The real question is whether reserves lead to the creation and lead to the increase in bank money. And as we just saw in QE1, which started back in 2009, 10 years ago, and that was stretched out over a number of years, quantitative easing and the increase in the Fed's balance sheet really didn't increase M2 all that much. But what's going to happen here in March of this year is that for 3 months, the Fed adds like $3 trillion to its balance sheet. So there's a lot more compression. The Fed just pounds its balance sheet with something like $3 trillion. So what we want to do is take another look at the Fed's balance sheet during this latest round of QE in this year, during the weeks that it added $3 trillion to its balance sheet, and see if in that time period M2 increases. So what we really need to do here is let's get rid of duds. Don't go far there, buddy. You're coming back. And let's get rid of these graphs. And what we need to do is we got to redraw this graph because this is like 10 years. So let's gonna redraw it over a much, shorter time period. I don't know, this is like 4 years, so that we can see this intense burst of activity. We can get a much clearer idea of what's going on when the Fed just hammers its balance sheet, which it's gonna do here. So let's look at the graph in this time period, the relevant graphs. First up, we have the Fed balance sheet, except it's more stretched out this time. You can see the taper part here more stretched out, and then over here on the right, this is when the New York Fed gets into the repo market. It's just more stretched out in this version of the graph. And next up, we have the stock market. And remember, the stock market only goes up all the time because the economy is so awesome. And there you can see the taper tantrum that I talked about earlier. When the Fed is tapering, the stock market has a little hiccup there. And finally, we have M2, which does its thing by increasing at a very predictable, very steady rate of 5% a year. And this was the scene on the market and the monetary scene when old Super Dudley came on TV to tell us ignorant peons that it's not even possible for the Fed to pump up this here stock market. And let's make that opaque by buying assets and jacking up the balance sheet. Can't be done. You know what? Rather than me reminding you of what Dudley said, let's just hear from the master in his own words.
The reason why the stock market is going up is pretty simple. The economy is doing well, earnings are rising, and the Fed has basically said that they're on hold for quite a while.
Okay, that was Dudley on January 29th of this year. The Fed is on hold for quite a while. The stock market is A-okay, nothing to worry about. Now let's see how that worked out. Keep your eye on the blue line over here on the right side of your screen toward the bottom. That's Fed assets. Remember, they're on hold according to Dudley. So let's just have a look and see how that worked out. Well, heavens to Betsy, who knew that the Fed being on hold for quite a while would mean it would take 107 years for the Fed to get the balance sheet to $4 trillion, and it would take 107 years and 3 months to get the balance sheet up to $7 trillion. That is some massive restraint shown by the Fed, is it not? Okay, so Dudley got one wrong. We all make mistakes, right? The important thing is that this massive spike of $3 trillion in the Fed's balance sheet would never, ever have any effect on the real economy, right? I mean, if I recall correctly, us serfs got quite the dressing down for even entertaining such a conspiratorial fantasy, right? Let's just recall what Dudley said.
They have this idea that when the Fed buys T-bills, they're adding reserves to the banking system, and somehow those reserves are leaking out and leading to greater demand for the stock market.
Well, Mr. Dudley is quite the tough guy against a straw man, is he not? Query how he fares against reality, however. M2 is here in orange, which is nothing but bank money in the regular economy. If Dudley is right, M2 should just continue on its merry way, hermetically sealed off from what the Fed is doing, which is all done with reserve money here. M2, in other words, should not escape this band right over here on the right. But what do we find here with M2? Holy cow. It looks like some of those reserves leaked out after all. What do you say, Bill? What you need to understand here is that as big of a liar as this graph makes of Bill Dudley, the reality is quite a bit worse because the scale of M2 here is a lot larger than the balance sheet scale. In other words, the orange M2 graph here is very much compressed. So what we want to do is we want to redraw M2 to make a dollar for dollar comparison rather than a 3-to-1 comparison or whatever. So I'm going to redraw it so the peak of M2 matches the peak of the balance sheet. And by doing that, we can isolate the relative increases in both M2 and Fed assets on a dollar for dollar basis. And what's going to happen here with M2 is that it's going to drop off. It's going to dip way below the x-axis over here. But the right side of it should fit on. So let's just erase M2 here, and we're going to redraw it as I mentioned. So let's just look. You need to be looking at the right side here. And look what we have here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have what appears to be a dollar for dollar match between the most recent blast of QE by the Fed on the one hand and its evil twin M2 in the real economy on the other hand. In other words, Bill Dudley is simply a straight up liar, like I told you in the beginning, and that graph shows it. Well, imagine that. Turns out that quantitative easing and reserves created out of thin air by the Fed actually can get into the real economy. And not just get into the real economy a little bit, but get into the economy reserve dollars can on almost a dollar for dollar basis with M2, with bank money. So let's actually look at the numbers. Let's get a reading, exact reading on the octane level of Bill Dudley's lie to the public's face when he says reserves can't leak out into the regular economy. Because I see quite a bit of leakage here, Bill, almost 100%. But let's look at the numbers and just see what they say. Here are the numbers from February 26th of this year until June 17th, just 4 months later. Let's start with the Fed balance sheet. It starts at $4.159 trillion, adds a cool point $2.94 trillion, and ends up at $7.1 trillion. And that's all reserve money. So it should not leak out into M2, the money supply, the bank money supply, according to Bill Dudley, but it does leak out, and it leaks out big time. M2 starts at $15.51 trillion. It adds $2.82 trillion and ends up at $18.33 trillion. That puts the final score at M2 gaining 96 cents for every dollar of reserves added to the balance sheet. I thought there wasn't any leakage, but the reality is that this round of QE this year, it's not just leakage, it's a sieve. And the implications of this are absolutely staggering. For now, though, the remaining question at bar is what effect these massive dual spikes in money had on the stock market. So let's take a look at that. What you're about to see is what the S&P 500 did right after Dudley was on TV. And there you go. Pretty major. You can see what's going on there, except that you can't really see very well because the stock market is on bottom of the three layers here. So let's peel back M2 and let's peel back its pumpalicious twin, the reserves, the balance sheet, and see what's going on here. First up, at the top, the stock market goes into free fall on February 26th, and the Fed wastes no time coming to the rescue 1 week later on March 4th and adds a cool $83 billion to its balance sheet. 2 weeks after that, before any lockdown in any state in the U.S. takes place, you have on March 18th, the Fed has added already $500 billion to its balance sheet. And guess what? After that, the Fed packs on another $2.5 trillion to its balance sheet, and the market gets up back to where it was. So, Bill Dudley telling you that reserves don't leak out and the Fed doesn't, try its damnedest to pump up the stock market, that's just a straight up lie. You can see that in the graphs. These numbers aren't lying to you. Bill Dudley's the liar, not the numbers. Okay, as we just saw, the Fed single-handedly injected $2.8 trillion of bank money into the real economy. Bill Dudley is simply a liar, like I told you. But something doesn't add up here. The last time I checked, there's 160 million stimulus checks had gone out. Even at $1,200 a check, which I know that it wasn't $1,200 a check, some people got partial checks, but even for the full amount, that comes to $192 billion. That's not even $0.2 trillion. And as we saw, like I said, the Fed added $2.8 trillion in M2 to the economy by itself. And that's going on against the backdrop of a bunch of Main Street businesses, millions of them, flat on their back. They're otherwise viable businesses that are about to go bankrupt as a result of this pandemic and be picked up for pennies in the dollars. And you don't see the Fed's fingerprints all over this so-called pandemic? Did you get the name of the turnip truck you fell off of, Opie? I hope so, because you got a big lawsuit on your hands. Did you ever bother to ask yourself who controls the publication of all scientific research in this country, since the pandemic's supposedly about science? Did you ever ask yourself whether maybe the Federal Reserve has something to do with the publication of scientific research in the U.S.? Hey, I've got an idea. Let's ask somebody who worked at the Fed, who worked at the New York Fed. Here's my man, Chris Whalen, and let's see what he says about the connection between the Federal Reserve on the one hand and the publication of science on the other hand. Here's what he says.
Because remember, these are economists at the Fed. They can't conceive of shutting down a big bank. It would just never occur to them.
Why?
Well, their socialist neo-Keynesian mindset is, I think, very obvious. You don't see any free market Ludwig von Mises threads in Fed research. They control all the research in the United States, through the National Science Foundation budget. The Fed actually controls all of that. So in the academic community, they only reward people that write in the same kind of, as I say, socialist neo-Keynesian patois.
Okay, well, there you have it. There is a connection between the Fed. The Fed controls the publication of all scientific research in this country. If you don't see the Fed's fingerprints all over this pandemic nonsense, I got some advice for you. Take your muzzle off, go get some oxygen, and start following the money, and things will start to make sense. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot for watching.